Put that lacquer right in my mouth before I started. Chew on it. All right, today's message is God's last days army. God's last days army. So it'll be an interesting topic, and this is kind of a depiction here of the second coming with all the angels. But who is God's army?
We are.
We are, right?
Yep.
I remember hearing a sermon by one of my favorite pastors, Walter Veith.
Oh,
And he talked about a time where he was coming to church and he had him and and a friend, and I think his wife, and all three of them had ailments. You know, one had a crutch, and one of them's limping, and they're all just kind of frail in the church. And he looks at the group of them, and he laughs and he says, "Look, the army of the Lord," But it's funny.
Yeah.
But it's true, right? We're so weak, and we're so, useless in some ways, and yet we are the ones that
We
God
are His
chooses
army.
to do it. He chooses the weak because that makes
Amen.
all the glory go to Him.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have to be like these mighty angels to be part of God's army, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
So God's people is His last days army.
Right.
So we talked before about the three angels' messages. Let's turn there to Revelation chapter 14. And we see the three angels' messages. And I'll remind you guys of this passage again because it's a very important passage at the end of time, basically.
Yeah.
What you see to set up the passage is that Revelation chapter 13 depicts the end of time, right?
Mm-hmm.
The end of Revelation chapter 13 ends with the mark of the beast issue, which we know is a last days issue, just before the end of time. Then it jumps into the Revelation chapter 14, and we see three angels' messages starting in verse 6. And then right after the three angels' messages are given to the world, we see the second coming of Christ depicted starting around verse 14. You see the Son of Man coming on a white cloud with the sickle to harvest the earth. So that's the second coming. So in between the mark of the beast and the second coming, right at the end of time, is the three angels' messages. And this is God's final warning message to the world because it deals with the final events. And you look at the messages, there's many things in them. The gospel, of course, is paramount, and that's part of the first angel's message. But also in the first angel's message, in verse 7, we see the message to fear God. And then also the idea that the judgment has come, right? Not that the judgment is coming, but the judgment has come, right? And then we see that Babylon is fallen, starting in verse 8, the second angel's message. And so that's the message of who Babylon is, right? Babylon the Great is fallen, that great city. And we've studied that before. And then the third angel's message warns us not to receive the mark of the beast. So this is a last days message, right? Depicted by three angels going to the whole world. And I like this visual here, this artist depiction of three angels, because it really summarizes the message as well, right? The first one tells that the time has come for judgment and we're near the end, right? It's got the hourglass. The second message points to the idea that the fear God and give glory to Him, and it quotes the second commandment. Actually, that's still part of the first message, but it points us back to the Creator and His Sabbath, right? And so the law of God is reminded. And then the last one points us to prophecy. And exposition of prophecy there in the Scripture. So, okay. So we studied that before, and we studied that when we looked at the remnant. So God has a last day message to give to this world before the end of time. Everyone needs to be warned, right? And we studied the idea of the remnant and how the remnant gives out this final message. And there's very few who are preaching this final message on who the beast is, what the mark of the beast is, and the fact that the judgment has begun. Very few are giving that message in the world today. So, since God's army is us, right? And this is his final message. These would be his marching orders to give these things to the world, right? Like an army has a job to do, these are our marching orders to give this message to the world. So here's my question. How many of us are called to be missionaries?
All of us.
All of us.
All of us, right?
The Great
In
Commission.
some ways, we are all called to be missionaries.
But when's the perfect place and time to start talking about this to someone?
It depends on the person. It depends on the situation. There's no simple answer. I wish I could just give you, this exact time, but you have to be, guided by the Spirit, with experience, experience really helps.
That's the main thing, though.
First thing, you got to be willing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Spiritually willing, Lord, I am ready for when the time comes. You will put into my spirit that time to speak. It's wonderful.
And you do
It's
your
wonderful.
best and God works with you.
Amen.
You don't have to worry about,
That's right.
I'm gonna not say everything perfect. I mean, you try to do your best, but God, he works with us, even with
He sure
with
does.
our failings,
With
and
our
imperfections.
Amen. Amen.
He
That's right.
He finds a way to make the message. Sometimes I've heard stories of people witnessing going door to door, and a young man goes to a door and he was so nervous, and he just stutters and he can't even get anything out. And the woman who opens the door felt so bad for this young man. She said, "Oh, just come inside." Just figured it, and he can't get anything out. But that was what God used to break down her barrier. She needed somebody who was stuttering, and so God can use our
Amen.
imperfections.
That's right.
Yeah. But the idea is that we're all called to be missionaries in some ways, right?
Right.
In some way, we should share our faith wherever we can, right?
Amen.
And by example, right? Sometimes we're put in situations where we can't, nowadays you have to be careful what you say to your work, right? You can't always be overt, in sharing the gospel, but you can be an example and you can be a light,
Amen.
and
Look how the room got brighter.
yeah, right.
Right when you said light, the
It
room
was
got
interesting.
brighter.
It did. It did, just right there.
Thank you, God.
And, it's an example, right? So we're all called to be missionaries, but in some ways, right? The answer really is yes and no. Because not all of us are called to go to some foreign land and plant churches, right? We're not all called to be literal missionaries, right? We're not all called to be pastors. There's some people who have that gift, and then there's the rest of us, right? But we're all supposed to do our part, but we're not all called to be teachers. So let's look at that. James chapter 3, verse 1.
James chapter 3.
And we could look at more verses than this, but here's one example.
I love James.
James 3, verse 1. I'm going to read this from, it's a little clearer from the New King James. Actually, if I can get it to work. Yeah, my internet's not connected on that one. That's an online version of the Bible.
I have a New King
You
James.
got a New King James?
Yeah.
What do you got there in James 3, 1?
My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment.
So are we all supposed to be teachers?
No.
No. Not all of us have that gift, and that's okay. I mean, you can witness to somebody simply by sharing what the Lord has done for you. It doesn't
Amen.
mean you're a teacher, right? And so there are individuals who are called as that's their particular gift. And there are people who that's their full-time job. And God wants them dedicated to that. So not every one of us is a frontline soldier, a general in the army. I thought you would like this picture, right?
I just
This is
have to
a
nudge them.
depiction of Washington. I think that's what I
Yep,
looked for.
that's Washington. Yep.
Washington leading the generals. You can't have an army if everyone's a general, right?
That's right.
Exactly.
That won't work. You only have so many of them, and then you have to have troops that actually, follow the lead of the generals, right? So not everyone is called to be that general on the front line, missionary, somebody going out planting churches in foreign
But,
lands.
but wouldn't the general be Jesus and the word lieutenant?
Well, he would be the top head commander, right?
Yeah.
But he's got the little underlings, you
Yeah.
know, under generals, right? We've got, you know, he breaks us up into groups and so forth. God's a God of order. Absolutely. But that's a good point. Absolutely. So not all of us are called into full-time ministry, right? That's my point. Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 10 and 11. And this gets into the idea of the gifts of the Spirit. I meant 11 and 12. I said 10 and 11, I meant 11 and 12. So Ephesians 4, verse 11 and 12. Somebody read that for us, please.
And he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ.
Good
Oh.
morning.
Hey,
Good to see you.
Good morning.
Come here.
All right.
Very good, because the kids.
Very nice to see you. Good to see you in a while.
Beside the.
Never met you, sir.
Yes.
Nice to meet you, sir.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, Sandra. Nice to meet you.
How are you?
Okay, let's sit beside the mayor.
Yeah.
Amado,
Really.
Amado,
Next to Amado.
Nice to see you.
a long time friend.
Wow,
Yeah.
wonderful.
Nice to see you.
Great.
Bless
So
you.
we're in Ephesians chapter 4. We're looking at the idea that not everyone is called to be a pastor or a teacher, missionary. So it says in verse 11 that he gave all to be apostles and pastors. Is that what it says?
No.
No, it says some, right?
Some, yeah.
So some are called to be prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers, and so forth, but not everybody. Okay, so if that's the case, and there are people whose gift and whose calling is to do full-time ministry, then how are those people to be supported, right?
Yeah.
That's the question. How do we support those who are called to full-time ministry? Because obviously, if you're doing full-time ministry, you don't have time to do full-time work as well, right? Because that is your work.
The ties?
So how do we support them?
Ties?
We'll get into this subject. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 through 14. The whole passage here, I want to read this whole passage because he gives the context. I've heard a lot of people argue against the idea that pastors, they say pastors aren't supposed to receive funds from the church, and I just don't understand how people can read these passages and not see how obvious this is. So, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, now remember, this is Paul writing to the Corinthian church. So it's a specific apostle writing to a specific church, and he's talking about the situation, but it gives us some context of what's to be expected. Now, before this, he talked about the idea that that he has the power, if he wants to, he has the authority to marry. Even though he didn't, we know that Paul remained unmarried. He might have, earlier in life, he might have been married and maybe his wife died. We don't know all the, before he came to the Lord. But when he was a apostle, he was single, and he wrote about that. But he didn't have to be. It wasn't a requirement. The Lord was fine with the apostles marrying. Peter was married. The Bible talks about his mother-in-law, right?
Yeah.
So that means he must have been married, right? So he talks about the idea that, verse 5, have we not power to lead about a sister or wife, as well as other apostles, and as our brethren of the Lord, and Cephas, that would be Peter. Verse 6, or only I and Barnabas, have we not power to forbear working, meaning to not work? Don't we have the power to do that? Who goes to warfare at any time in his own charge? That's a good metaphor, right? What soldier goes to war and
You're
pays for
living.
his own supplies,
No.
and feeds himself while he's fighting the battle, working a job and then coming to go fight. That doesn't happen. If you're going to war, the idea is that whoever enlisted you in that military is going to
Supply?
supply you, right? That's the idea. No soldier goes to war of his own charge. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit thereof? Right? If you're working in a vineyard, the idea is that you get some of the fruits of it, right? Who feeds a flock and does not eat of the milk of the flock? Say I these things as a man, or saith not the law the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, Thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. So the idea is, when you have a working oxen, you weren't supposed to put a muzzle on it so that it couldn't eat. The idea was that they would, if you were a really greedy farmer and you wanted to stop your oxen from eating while it's working, you put a muzzle on the ox, so while it's treading in the fields, it can't eat, the stuff around it while it's working in the field. And there was an Old Testament law that said, don't do that. It's poor oxen, right?
Yeah.
They don't even get to eat while you're working them to death, right? And so Paul uses this as a metaphor and says, you're not supposed to make this animal work and not feed it. And he says that's a metaphor for those who work in the gospel ministry. You don't muzzle it and make it so the laborer cannot eat, right? While he's working. So he says, does God take care for oxen? Verse 10, or saith he it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and he that thresheth in hope should be partaker of this hope. Now this, again, Paul's using figurative language, but the idea is that he's saying those who tread in the working in the fields, the idea, or plowing, the idea is somebody who's sowing the gospel seed. That's the metaphor. And they're supposed to eat of the fruit of their labors. Verse 11. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? Now that's an interesting point here, because Paul is taking what we usually view as of importance, and he's flipping it upside down. We usually view the material things as more important, and then the spiritual things as, that's kind of a side issue. But Paul's saying the more important thing is the spiritual things. That's more important than the earthly things, right? And so Paul is saying, look, if I gave you this spiritual message, right? If I sowed spiritual things to you, which is more important than carnal things, is it a big deal if I reap from you the carnal things, the things of this world? No. Which one's more important? The spiritual things, right? So Paul is basically saying, I've given you a greater gift than you're giving me, right?
Yeah.
That's the idea. Verse 12, if others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? So, others are being paid to do the ministry. Why not the apostles of the Lord? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Now, this is an important point. Paul, what he did this voluntarily. Just as he could have been married and he could have had a wife, he voluntarily chose to stay single, right? He didn't have to. That's not required, right? The Catholic Church teaches that the cardinals and the priests and the bishops, they can't get married. That's nowhere in the Bible will you find that. In fact, in the Old Testament, the Levites, they were commanded they had to get married. Why? Because they had to have kids. Because that was a particular tribe that was of the priests, right? So they had to have descendants to keep the priesthood going. You had to get married if you were a Levite, whereas it's the opposite in the Catholic Church. Now, Paul remained single, but voluntarily, right? He didn't have to. In the same way, he didn't ask the Corinthian church to support him financially, although he could have. See, what he's saying is, we have not used this power over you, but we could have, basically. The idea is, he's arguing the right to do that, the right to not work and to receive support from the church, but then saying, we particularly, Paul and Barnabas, have chosen not to. What did Paul do instead? Do you remember his occupation?
It was a tent maker.
He was a tent maker. And he did this, he says, so he could be an example to the flock, right? But not all the apostles did that. Other apostles were and not only, you know, there was times where other apostles would do their trade as well, but it seems like Paul is making the argument that he's an exception. Most of the apostles were actually supported by the church, and they didn't have to work. And that's the way it should be, right? Because they have these great spiritual gifts to preach and give these messages from God. Why should they spend all their time doing some kind of manual labor, right? They should spend as much time as they can giving the message, right? So, but Paul didn't do that. Paul said, you know, I'm going above and beyond, right? He didn't have to, but he decided to go above and beyond and work as well. Okay, so verse 12, let's read this again. If others be partakers of this power over you, or not we rather, nevertheless we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that they which minister about the holy things live of the things of the temple? And they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar. Even so has the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Is that pretty clear? So the idea is that he gives the example of the Old Testament, that the priests in the Old Testament, that would work in the temple, they received a portion of the sacrifices that were given in the temple. And of the temple services, the showbread, right? The priests would eat of the showbread. They would eat the things that the people would give to the temple. The priests lived off of those things. And so Paul gives that an example, and he says, even so, in the same way, those who preach the gospel should live of the gospel. So Paul gives the example of the Old Testament system and how the priests lived off of the offerings of Israel, right? And now he translates that over to those who are preachers of the gospel. And there's a parallel there. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, you know, the Old Testament system, whatever. But Paul here just drew a direct correlation between the priests in the Old Testament living off of the offerings of the people, and now those who preach the gospel living off of the offerings of the people. Does that make sense? Paul didn't take this. He said, I'm going to go above and beyond. I'm not going to get married even though I could. And I'm going to work even though I don't have to. He went above and beyond. But he argues, I have that power. I could not work if I wanted to. You know? I gave you these spiritual things. It's a small thing to ask for the carnal things in return. That's his argument, right? So, how are those who are called to full-time ministry supposed to be supported? By the church. The church is supposed to support them, right? Those who are not called to be pastors and full-time ministers and so forth, we are to help support those who are, right? That's the idea. Let's read another passage. 1 Timothy 5, verse 17. And you know what? When you look at this in the correct light, it's an honor to be a part of the ministry in that way, right? It is a privilege to help support those who are called to be missionaries and pastors. Have you guys ever heard of people who will write letters to soldiers on the front lines? Or send care packages to soldiers on the front lines? You guys ever do that?
Oh, yeah.
Do you feel that, do you do that begrudgingly? Oh, I have to.
No.
Oh,
Do it with
I
joy.
have to help these soldiers. No, right? You do it. You're happy. You say,
Absolutely.
my part is so much smaller than what they're doing, right?
Yes.
That's the way that we should view
Amen.
those who are called to the ministry.
Amen.
They're the ones on the front lines, and we're
That's
just
right.
doing a small part by supporting them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We should view it the same way.
1
Timothy chapter 5, verse 17 and 18. Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in word and doctrine. That means they labor in, what does it mean to labor in word and doctrine? What do you guys think?
To work.
What does it mean to labor in the word and doctrine?
Study,
Ministry.
study.
Study and preach.
And preach.
Yeah,
yes.
those who are laboring in the word and the
Laboring,
doctrines, the
that's
teachings, right?
Mhm.
They're studying and preaching the message. They should be counted worthy of double honor, he says. And then he quotes this verse again. For the scripture saith, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his reward. It's funny how some people view, you wouldn't expect to go to work in any profession and just do it for free. And yet sometimes we feel that you could argue the most important profession in the world, those who preach the gospel, they should just do it for free, But the Bible says the laborer is worthy of his reward, right? They should be supported by the church. 2
Good
Corinthians,
Good.
chapter 11, verse 7 to 9. Now again, this is Paul writing to the Corinthians, and this is a specific case, what Paul did. It's very interesting. He wanted to reach the Corinthian church, and he wanted to reach those believers, and so what he did, for whatever reason, he felt this was the best situation in that, the best action to take in that situation. He decided not to ask them to support him, but instead he had other churches support him while he was preaching to them. Very interesting. I'm not sure exactly why, but that's what he did. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 7 through 9. Have I committed an offense in abasing myself that you might be exalted? Because I have preached to you the gospel of God freely? I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. And when I was present with you and wanted, I was chargeable to no man. For that which was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. And in all things, I have kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and so will I keep myself. So Paul saying this particular Corinthian church, he didn't ask them to support him, although he does argue I could have, but I didn't. And it's almost as if he's shaming them by saying, look, I didn't even ask for you guys' support, although I could have. I had these other brethren help me. The brethren from Macedonia, they supplied me whatever I needed. Other churches, I took wages from them so that I can minister to you. That kind of gives you a little bit of the insight of the way things went back then, the way that the gospel order was set up. But we do see that Paul was supported by the Macedonians, by other brethren, right? Even though he could have asked the Corinthians to help support him as well, he didn't. And for whatever reason, he chose not to.
It's interesting that he used the Macedonians to compare because they were the poorest churches, one of the poorest.
It's as if he's shaming the Corinthians, right?
And you guys can do it, but they, who can barely feed themselves, they supported
me.
Yeah.
Wow, interesting point. Good point. Okay, so we see that we're supposed to support those who minister, but the question is, how do we support them? How do we support the ministers and missionaries? How exactly do we do it? Well, let's look at a couple different ideas. There's two models that are prominent today, and I want to compare the two. One is the local church model, and the other is the tithe model. We're going to compare the two. That's what you brought up there. That's what Matthew brought up here, the idea of the tithe model. Okay, so on the left-hand side here, we'll look at the local church model, and on the right-hand side, we'll look at the model of tithe, the tithe system. One part that's key in the tithe system that's not, I'll kind of preface this with, is that in the Old Testament tithe system, which Paul pointed to as an example, it wasn't as if each local city collected tithe from the people and then the Levites in that area got whatever was in that area. That's not how it worked. Because if that's how it worked, then if you lived in a rich city and you were a Levite, you got a lot, right? And if you lived in a poor city and you were a Levite, you didn't get much. That's not how it worked. The way it worked in the Old Testament was all the tithe was to be collected in one place. It says into the storehouse. And then it was divided equally among the Levites. That way, if you lived in a rich area or a poor area, the Levites would be taken care of equally. That's the idea. It was a fair system. So, in many local churches, many local congregations that are just kind of independent congregations, pastors are paid based on the wealth of the local church. So if the local congregation is rich, guess what happens to the local pastor?
Yeah,
The
he's-
pastor is rich.
He's driving a Mercedes, and not to bag on anybody, but that's kind of that cliche of the pastor in a Cadillac, right? That's kind of cliche, right? And nowadays we see a lot of extreme examples of that. You have guys like the Creflo Dollars of the world,
Oh, yes.
and I won't get to name into too many names, but you guys know these televangelists who are multi-millionaires,
Yep.
sprawling mansions.
Well, they want the big,
Sound good.
And some of this is from work they've done in other areas, and you definitely don't want to. It's not a sin to be rich, but the love of money is the problem, right?
Mhm.
And the way it's done sometimes
That's
is the
right.
problem, right?
Amen.
And sometimes it's to the point where they're taking more from the flock than should be done, right? So, but the problem is, the basic idea of this local kind of, whatever the church gets in this local area, the pastor gets that. The problem with that, of course, is, again, if the local congregation is rich, that local pastor is rich. And if the local congregation is poor, that pastor is poor. And so it's not an even system. On top of that, if you're in a situation like that, let's say you're a pastor, imagine this, right? You're a pastor, and you have a message to preach. God has given you a message to preach to the congregation. But you say to yourself, so-and-so sit in the front pew and has got a lot of money and they support the church a lot. I know they're not going to like this message. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I shouldn't preach this, right? You see how the problem that can
oh,
create?
yes.
Yes.
And so you're very, you know who's giving what as the
We see
pastor,
it today.
and so you could
Yes.
We
kind of,
see it today.
yeah, it happens.
Amen.
It happens. And so people will not give those messages that the congregation may need to hear
Mm-hmm.
because certain people may be offended, right?
Amen.
That's part of the problem with this local church kind of, everything goes to the local pastor kind of thing. There's other issues, The pastor could be tempted to grow the church to grow the support base, right? As opposed to actually getting real converts. Grow the church just to get more people to, not saying that all pastors do that, but there's a temptation, right? Okay. Now the other system, the tithe system, the way this was set up, again, in the Old Testament, was that it was to be equal distribution among the Levites. So all the tithe was collected into the storehouse and then equally distributed. So it didn't matter if you were a Levite who lived in a poor city or a rich city, you were to get the same amount. That's the idea. Now I'll give you guys the example of, in the SDA church, what we do. In the SDA church, we do the tithe system. And again, we collect it in local areas, right? So, cost of living is different in different areas, but for example, we're in the Central California Conference. And there's all the different churches that are over this whole part of the state. And it's all collected into one central area and then distributed among all the pastors equally. So the idea is, they do a small cost of living increase if you're, if you're in Chular versus San Jose, it's a lot harder to live in San Jose, right? So they do a little bit more, but it's pretty close to the same for all the pastors. That way it's even. So if you preach to a congregation that is poor, you don't have to worry about it. And if you preach to a congregation that's rich, it doesn't matter. If you don't have to silence your message because maybe some wealthy member is not going to like it, because you're getting the same amount, it doesn't matter.
And then it becomes like a love of money because you're more worried about what they're gonna give than what
Exactly.
message.
And what your heart really
Exactly.
wants to say.
And so by doing it equally, distributing it equally like that, you free the pastors to preach whatever the Lord has put on their heart, right? That's the idea. Not that we have a perfect system, but I think it's based on the Old Testament model and it works pretty well. So it doesn't matter if the congregation is rich or not, and it doesn't matter if the message is going to step on somebody's toes or not when you do it that way. So I think the system works well. Okay, now some people might ask, Joshua, isn't tithing part of the old covenant, right? The answer actually is that tithing was before the old covenant. Did you know that?
No.
It was actually predated the creation of the nation of Israel. It was way before then. Genesis chapter 14, way back in Genesis, is when this was begun with Abraham. Genesis chapter 14, verse 20. Try and finish this quickly here. Genesis 14, verse 20. You guys know the story of when Abraham went and freed Lot, right? Remember when Lot got
Yes.
taken captive?
Uh-huh.
And Abraham went and freed him, and freed all the prisoners who had been taken captive, but he didn't take any of their stuff, any of the spoil. And then he met with Melchizedek afterwards, the priest of the Most High God. And Abraham blessed, or Melchizedek blessed Abraham, and Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek, to the priest. He gave a tenth of all he owned to the priest. And blessed be the Most High God, which have delivered thine enemies into thine hand. That's what Melchizedek said to him. And he, speaking of Abraham, gave him, Melchizedek, tithes of all. So that's where it started, back in Genesis 14. His son, or his descendant, Jacob, continued the practice in Genesis 28, verse 22, when he fled from his home because he was afraid of Esau. He fled from his home and he went, remember he went and lived with Laban, and he worked 14 years, 7 years for Rachel, but he ended up with Leah, and then another 7 years for Rachel, right? When he was on his way running away, he was in the desert, in the wilderness, and remember he slept his head on a rock, and he had a dream of a ladder that ascended to heaven. This is the artist's depiction of that. Jacob sleeping on the rock.
Like
This artist's
Jacob's
depiction.
ladder.
Yeah, the ladder to heaven.
Jacob's ladder.
Jacob's ladder, right?
Yeah, there's a song called, You Were
Uh-huh.
Climbing
Jacob's
Jacob's
Ladder.
Ladder.
Jacob's ladder.
Absolutely, and that was a metaphor for Christ, right? Because Jesus says, soon after you will see heavens open and the angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So the ladder from earth to heaven is an object lesson of Jesus. He is the link between earth and heaven. Amen?
Amen.
But Jacob, when he had that dream, he said this, verse 22, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give a tenth unto thee.
Yeah.
So tithing was way back before the nation of Israel existed, back in Abraham and Jacob's days. Okay, so, well that's cool, tithes in the Old Testament, but what does the New Testament say? So we've seen that tithe predates the Old Covenant that was set up with Moses. It was hundreds of years before Moses. But what does the New Testament say? Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. Now there's a couple verses on this. There's not that many, but there's a few verses in the New Testament that mention this. The context here is Jesus speaking to the Pharisees and their hypocrisy, and how they would make such a big deal out of the smallest point in the Old Testament law and yet ignore big things like mercy and love, right? Verse 23, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin. Interesting. And have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought you have to done, and not have leave the other undone. So the idea is Jesus is kind of mocking them. He's saying, look, here's this kind of depiction of different herbs. Imagine somebody with their herb garden, right? And they have mint, and they're counting the mint leaves. Make sure God gives 1/10 of all the mint leaves, right? They're just going, just the tiniest, and that's how the Pharisees were. I'm so exact. And I make sure that I'm doing everything perfect and counting the seeds. Make sure God gives 1/10 of everything, right? And he's saying, you're tithing your herbs, your little herbs. You're making a big deal of that. But you're ignoring mercy, judgment, and faith, right? Now, does Jesus say, therefore, throw the tithing out the window?
No.
No.
No, he says you ought to have done this, and not left the other undone.
Undone.
Jesus wants both.
Amen.
Right?
Amen.
Do you see that? And so
Oh, yeah.
many people read these passages and they say, oh, we're not supposed to be legalistic. Jesus is just throwing all that stuff out the window. It's literally not what he said. He just says the Pharisees are taking it to an extreme and yet ignoring the whole point of the gospel.
Amen.
Right?
That's right.
And the same thing is in Luke 11, verse 42. And we're almost done here. We got one more slide. Luke 11, verse 42. Tells the same idea. But woe unto you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs. So obviously those are small things, the herbs, right? Oh, those are some cute little boots. Nice little rain boots. Those are pretty cute. Those are pretty cute. So they're tithing their herbs, right, which is small stuff in the garden. And you pass over judgment and the love of God. These you ought to have done and not have left the other undone. So twice we see in the Gospels that Jesus says you ought to do this, right? You ought to do the tithe and not leave the other undone.
Yeah, that's perfectly.
That's all you
Yeah.
see in the New Testament.
Oh, yeah, that
And,
is
and
so.
the thing is, there is nothing in the New Testament that says don't tithe anymore.
That's right.
In fact, you see 2 times in the Gospel where Jesus says you ought to.
Amen.
So where did we get this idea that you throw it out the window, right? If the New Testament, if Jesus says in the Gospels you ought to do this, but not leave the other undone, then where's your argument from the Bible to get rid of it?
Maybe they misconstrue the word undone because, oh, it's undone. The type is undone.
No, well,
It's done.
that's obviously not the subject. Don't leave the other undone, meaning judgment and mercy. Don't leave that undone. That's the subject of undone. So that's all you got from the Gospels on the subject of tithing, is not to leave it undone. Now, the idea, I understand, we are not supposed to, not everything in the Old Testament law is meant for Christians today. We don't sacrifice animals anymore, right? We don't have to keep the feast days. You don't have to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year on the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles. That was an Old Testament law. You had to go
It
to
will be
Jerusalem.
expensive if it's.
That would be expensive.
Yeah.
We don't have Levites. We don't have a temple. There's all these. They had a rule where you had to have a blue ribbon on all your clothing. We don't have these laws. We don't have the laws on how to run the nation of Israel because the nation doesn't exist anymore. We are Israel today. But there are specific things that are mentioned in the New Testament that do carry over. There are specific things that are left, and there are specific things that the New Testament says don't do that anymore. For example, the New Testament points out circumcision and says don't do that. It's very clear, don't do that anymore. It points out the feast days, you don't need to do that. It points out sacrifices, you don't have to do those. And so if the New Testament points something out and says you don't do that anymore, that's done away with. But if twice in the Gospels it says, hey, it brings up the subject of tithe and says you ought to, then what's your argument for getting rid of it? There is nothing in the New
There isn't
Testament.
anything.
There just isn't. And in fact, we see Paul arguing that the churches should support those who preach the gospel. Let me give you one last verse on this. Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 8. And the beauty of the tithing system, again, it's a fair system because those who don't have much don't have to give much, right? If all you've got is $1 to your name, it's only 10 cents, right? It's a fair system. And so it's proportional. It's a beautiful system. One other thing I'll point out is that we may argue, well, this church or such and such church, they are so corrupt. I'm not giving my money to those people, right? But do you remember the story of the widow with the 2 mites?
Mm-hmm.
Where did she give her money? She gave it to the local synagogue. The local synagogue where the leaders were against Jesus. And what did Jesus say about that? Did he say, no, don't give your money to those people. Give it to me and my group. We're better, right? No, he blessed her for what she did. Because even though she doesn't know what's going to happen to it when she gives it, she gave of the right, with the right heart, right? And so God, it's between you and God.
Amen.
What happens to it afterwards, that's between whoever has it and them and God, right?
Yeah.
And so Jesus praised her for her gift.
Didn't Jesus also say, for God loves a cheerful giver?
Mhm.
Well, certainly.
Yes, that
Yeah.
is in the New Testament, absolutely. God
Comes
loves
from
a
the
cheerful
heart.
giver. So Hebrews chapter 7, verse 8, this is the last verse, last passage on tithes that I could find in the New Testament. And the subject here is Melchizedek, and he's drawing parallels between, the writer of Hebrews drawing parallels between Melchizedek and Christ, because Melchizedek was a type of Christ. He wasn't Jesus, but he was a type of Jesus. He was an object lesson for Jesus, because he was a priest of the Most High God, just like Jesus is priest of the Most High God. And he speaks about tithing. In verse 8, he says, here, men that die receive tithes. But there, now there would be heaven, he receives them, meaning Jesus, receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he liveth. So you see that? It takes a little bit of explaining who the he and what the
Yeah,
there is,
yeah.
but here on this earth, men that die receives tithes, but there in heaven, he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he liveth. So the idea is that Jesus is still receiving tithes from his people today. Because when you support the gospel minister, what you do for the least of the brethren, you're doing for
Doing
Christ.
unto him.
And so if you support somebody who's preaching Jesus' message, you are supporting, you are giving your money to Jesus. You're
Amen.
giving it to God,
Amen.
really. And not just to the instrument God is using. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, here's the argument. Here's the case for tithing. People may disagree with this, but this is all I can find in the Bible and the New Testament on this subject. The practice is mentioned in the New Testament twice, and it says, according to Jesus, it's something that should be done. Never are we told in the New Testament not to tithe. And we see that the system works beautifully and fairly to support the ministers while avoiding those problems of the local pastor becoming rich or having to silence his message for members who have some money but who may not want to hear what he has to say. So it solves all those problems. Fair system, mentioned in the New Testament as that's something that should be done, and it's never mentioned in the New Testament as something that's done away with. So I think that is the case for tithing.
Amen.
Do you have any questions on that?
Amen. Just one
Yes.
question here.
Sir,
I have a case with this
yes,
because I love to give.
yes,
I love to give.
yes.
But sometimes I will spread it, not just
Uh-huh,
everything
yeah.
taken and put onto that church because I'm
Uh-huh.
going to that church
Uh-huh,
or whatever it is. I love this ministry
Yeah,
here
yeah,
or whatever.
Yeah,
I will split.
yeah.
What is your take on that? What would you,
Well,
I don't see
all-
anything
Yeah, I hear you. All we're told in the New Testament
where I'm really
is that
compelled to give.
the idea of who is to be supported by the tithe, it's simply, the way it's described is those who preach the gospel.
Yes.
So if you're finding people or organizations that are preaching the gospel and sending your tithe to places that are preaching the gospel, that fulfills the requirement, as
In
far
other
as I
words,
can
yeah,
see.
it's a real burden.
Yeah.
Not a burden, I shouldn't say, but it's what's the word I want to use? I'm really drawn to do this,
Yeah.
compelled.
Yeah. There's a lot of good places out there
Oh,
to
yes.
that are preaching the gospel message, and then it's supposed to go to preaching the gospel
Right.
message.
So in
And
other
supporting
words,
those who are preaching the gospel.
so in other words, we're not just obligated to where we are attending
Not
to just
necessarily.
fully 100% of that tithe.
I would. It's not specified. So
No, it's
so pray,
not.
So
That's-
pray about it and let God guide you on that.
Well,
But what I do know is it needs to
that's-
go to those who are preaching the gospel. Tithes shouldn't necessarily go toward other worthy things like care for the poor or something like that. That should be something else.
So that is separate, absolutely. That
Yes.
I agree 100%.
Yeah, that's
Tithes and
Tithes
offerings.
Yeah, and the
Yes.
the way, the idea is so that those who are preaching the gospel have that minimum, there's that minimum guarantee of the 10% is gonna go, so that the gospel's not neglected, right? But who's preaching the gospel, you know, and so God will guide you.
Oh,
you know,
yeah, absolutely.
on
So,
Because I labored with that many a
so
year.
it's okay
Lord,
to
yeah.
split the tithe, say, like, half goes to the church and half goes to someone else who's preaching the gospel?
Well,
Or should it
well,
go?
you could argue, what's the church, right? I mean, if you have an independent, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Hello, princess.
Oh,
Yes.
she's so cute. If you have a minister who's out there preaching the gospel and doing it, you know, you could argue John the Baptist, right? Was he connected to the Sanhedrin? No, not necessarily. He was more of an independent minister, right? But would it have been wrong to give him some support? I don't think so. So, but you have to, you know, God will guide. God will
Yes,
guide.
he does, and he
Yeah,
does.
God will guide on that. And
Amen.
we're not given too many specifics on it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's something that I think, you know, let each one be persuaded as own mind. I do think that the focus should be toward the church, because God has ordained the church as his arm and his
voice.
his voice in the world.
His voice,
You know,
that's
that
right.
should be the focus, but there's
Absolutely.
special cases
Yeah.
of people who are
Yeah, 'cause
independent ministry.
There was a
so forth.
preacher on TV who said, you can tithe in other ways. You can tithe by baking a cake for someone. And I'm like, that's different.
It's nice, but I don't think that's
Yeah.
Anyway, good questions. Let's wrap this up with prayer so that people can go to the, or we can do, I don't know how we're gonna do
I
it.
was told,
Figure it out.
I just went there because I knew I'm already late, and the Elder Cho told me that there is a
Told you to
separate,
come here?
yeah.
So Young said,
where
come
she
out
down
there.
Today.
We're not quite sure yet. Well, let's have a prayer and we'll figure it out. Good questions.
I want
Somebody
to
wanna pray for us?
say something quickly though.
Oh.
I just saw this right now in Mark and Luke.
Yeah.
Jesus talks about the widow,
Ah,
and it says the same thing. It says she gave all her livelihood. She didn't pay a tithe, she paid,
yeah, she went above and beyond.
she just turned it in.
That's all she had left.
Incredible,
It's
incredible,
incredible.
yeah.
Amen.
Well, who would like to pray for us?
Good stuff. Boy.
Good stuff, right? Who would like to pray?
Good stuff. Good stuff.
Anybody?
I will pray.
Please, thank you.